On this next slide, we look again, as always, to see if there's a common factor. But this slide is more dedicated to things where you don't have a simple x squared in the front. And these tend to be more complicated. When you see something like this where you have a trinomial and you're trying to factor it, thinking about the last thing and the middle thing as what adds to this and what adds to that and multiplies to this doesn't always work so well. So then it's about experimentation and seeing what you get when you try to figure this out. So what I mean by that is I look at 5x squared plus 8x plus 3, and I try to do this factorization. What I know is if I'm going to factor this, since there are no common factors, I will have to have a 5x and an x in order to get 5x squared. And the only way I can produce positive 3 in here, because there are no negatives whatsoever, are a 3 and a 1. But when I do this, I must also produce an 8x in the middle. To that end, I have to use 3 and 1, but produce an 8x. That means I'm going to put a 3 in the first parentheses and a 1 in the second, and everything's positive. If I want to check to see if my answer is correct, here's what I do. I know that the 5x times the x is 5x squared. I know that the 3 times the 1 is 3. So I know that my first thing and my last thing are good to go. However, I need to check my middle term. This middle term thing that I'm looking at, this positive 8x, has to be produced when I multiply the inners and when I multiply the outers. So the inners produce 3x, the outers produce 5x, 3x, and 5x gives me my middle term of 8x. So if you want to check, the only way really to take a look at this is when you look at what happens when you multiply the inners and the outers. Does it produce that middle term? That's the strategy that I would suggest. Okay, and I'll do number 4, I guess, because it's to the right. 2x squared minus 9x minus 18. There are no common factors again. So I look at this and I say, okay, if I was going to be able to factor this, I'm looking at numbers that produce 2x squared. That can only be done with a 2x and an x. And then factors of 18 are 1 and 18, 2 and 9, 3 and 6. So I have to look for some kind of combination. Now, the truth is that in the end, I have to find a combination that when I'm using the 2x and the x, I produce 9. Generally, not always, I use the ones that are closest to each other. So I like to stick with, in this case, the 3 and the 6. If the 3 and the 6 don't work for me, I will go back and then try the 2 and the 9, and then the 1 and the 18. But usually, the numbers that are closest together work the first time. So now I got to figure out where to put my 3 and where to put my 6. Do you remember that I said there were no common factors? Do you remember that? If there are no common factors, that means in the first parentheses, I can't put the 6. Because if I put a 6 in there, I would have 2x and a 6, and that means there would be a common factor of 2 in both of those numbers, a 2 and a 6. So the 6, if I'm going to use it, must go in the last parentheses. So I go to the last parentheses and I put my 6, which means my 3 has to go in the first. And I notice that the 18 is negative. So now somehow, as I look at this information, I'm looking for some way that 3x and 12x produce negative 9x. And that can only happen if the 12x is negative and the 3x was positive. Remember, we're looking to figure out, can I produce this middle negative 9x thing? When I look at that, I'm looking at positive 3x and negative 12x. And if you produce the positive 3x and the negative 12x together, that would make negative 9x overall. This trial and error method doesn't always work on the first time. The more you try it, the more that you will produce less errors, or the less errors you'll produce overall, I guess, and you'll get it maybe in one of your first couple of tries. It's not a perfect science. Number 3. Number 3 I look at and I say, oh, look, no common factors again. So in number 3, as I try to work with this one, I will write down 2 parentheses, and I will put down a 2x and an x. The reason I'm doing that is because the 2x times x produces 2x squared. And then I look at the things that would produce a 12. So I could do 12 and 1. I could do 2 and 6. And I could do 3 and 4. Which ones do you think I would try first? 3 and 4. Because the 3 and the 4, in my opinion, are going to have your best chance of success. Am I always right the first time? Maybe not. But most of the time I am. So as I look at the 3 and the 4, one of those two numbers I can't put in the first parentheses. The 4. Because that means the 2 and the 4 would have a common factor of 2. So I know if I'm going to use 3 and 4, the 4 must go in the second parentheses. Now I might be wrong on this try, so let's just see. If I put the 3 in the first, everything's positive, so I write down plus signs. I go to check, hey, can I produce that 11x when I go to look at my middle terms? Inners, 3x. Outers, 8x. Do 3x and 8x produce 11x?
Yeah.
Yes, so I guessed right the first time. Yay for me. Notice that I used 3 and 4 because it was producing the 12, 2x and x because it produced the 2x squared. You know now? In number 5, no common factors. I put down my two parentheses. I've got to go with 2x and x. And there's only two numbers that produce a 7. So I need to use the 7. Should I try the 7 in the first or the second parentheses? First. Okay, so I put the 7 here. It means I have to put a 1 in the back there. And somehow, when I multiply the 7 and the x, the 1 and the 2, I have to produce negative 5x. So the sign that goes in between the 2x and the 7? Minus. And then, ta-da, you're done. Good job. If you got number 4, the last one. The thing that's kind of trickier about this one is actually that we have in the very beginning a 6x squared. The reason I say that that's trickier is because the 6 then has two combos, 6 and 1, or also 3 and 2. Whereas the 3 over here only has a 3 and a 1 combo. So when I look at that, it's just like looking at the last term. I generally try to stick with the ones that are closer together. So as I factor this one, since there are no common factors, I'm going to start trying all of my things with 3x and x. And then I know that if I'm going to produce that middle term of 7x, when I write down my information, the 3 and the 1, I need to have the middle things, the inners, and the outers produce 7. But I already actually know that the 3 out of the 3 and the 1 cannot go in the first parentheses because that would have a common factor. So I know that the 3 out of the 3 and the 1 combo that we talked about has to go in the second parentheses if I'm going to use it. It cannot go in the first. And the 1 would have to go in the first parentheses. So as I look at the inners and the outers and I try to produce this, what I notice is when I do this, I have 1x in the middle and 9x. Oh my goodness, I made a mistake. Is that what you're going to tell me, Nick?
Yep.
Okay, so I can't do that because, of course, it wasn't x. It was 2x. Sorry. Thank you, Nick. So somehow my 3 and my 3 that I'm writing down, I'm going to use that 9x, and then the inner terms, 2x, to produce a 7. The 7 has to be positive, so I'm going to put the plus sign with the 3 and the minus sign with the 1, because now the outer terms produce positive 9x, and the inner terms produce negative 2x. So 9x at minus 2x is the middle term of 7x.